Howdy. I've unfortunately cursed myself back into a mini obsession with Deltarune at a time when nobody's really making Deltarune content. Almost like it's been wrung dry after having very little new info to go off of since Chapter 2's release over 2 years ago. But that means we're quickly approaching the same amount of time it took for Chapter 2 to release after Chapter 1. So I'd say it's finally almost reasonable to expect the next... or maybe not. Thanks for the timely update when I'm halfway through making this video. But at the very least, I don't anticipate any big new reveals or revelations to happen until chapters 3 and 4 come out, so it's a pretty good time to catalog every possible detail I could think of into one place for easy, mindless consumption while you're doing something else. But first, let's have a quick little refresher. Our protagonist, Chris, child of dreamers, lover of knives, befriender of bullies, is not us. After our adventure in the Dark World, we go back to sleep to end off Chapter 1, but Chris pulls out their state-of-the-art heart and acts without our inputs, pretty much confirming that Chris and the player are separate entities. And living up to the 2 in the name, in Chapter 2, they do it twice. First to climb out the window and allegedly slash the tires on Toriel's car, then again to open the front door, open the TV, also known as turning it on, and open a dark fountain in the living room, which means we're probably starting Chapter 3 in the Dark World. We have quite a lot more confirmed info for Chapter 3 than we do for 4. First of all, this Dark World will be TV themed. And it seems to be pretty much just TV, not based on everything in the Dreamer household. Although there is this green room, which is TV related, but it clearly references Chris and Azriel's rooms with these couches, so I feel like we can expect some allusions to the rest of the house, and whatever insight into the Dreamers that may give us. This room also shows up in the Spampton Sweepstakes, a big anniversary charity event themed around the beloved Spampton G. Spampton. Hidden beneath all the spammy jammy ick of Spampton were a lot of pages about Chapter 3's Dark World. I don't know if the specific pages that each of these doors link to has any significance, but this middle door links to the changing room. This right door just leads to the turned off TV, which either means that's where we start the chapter from, or just confirms that the locations of these pages has no significance and I'm just stupid. And lastly, the door on the left, I guess would lead to the weather station, with these 2 weather bozos. We later learned that they're named El Niño and La Niña after the 2 weather patterns. Or wait, no, it's El Niña and La Niño, because they're trans? I don't know, that's not how Spanish works. There's also these 50s noir-styled Shadow Men enemies, and we've been told to expect 2 minutes of mildly entertaining shootout action. So yeah, TV. Most importantly though, there's Mike and Tenna. Mike was mentioned a staggering 2 whole times by Spampton Deltarune, which is only surprising because I always forget the second time. Due to the second mention being very similar to how Jevil name-dropped Queen a chapter early after you beat the pipe cleaners out of him, people initially guessed that Mike would be the main boss of Chapter 3 and be the TV itself. Pretty logical guess, if you're from the Stone Age, but we have the future.
God bless Spampton.
This page seems to counter both of those ideas, referring to Mike separately from the TV, who, based on the URL, seems to be Tenna, and implying that Tenna wronged Mike in some way. Although Spampton also seems to have been friends with Tenna at some point, as his friend's shop dialogue lists CRTs next to easels, and we assume easels is Swatch, so we can guess that Tenna is within the same realm of former friend who Spampton feels abandoned or betrayed by. That's pretty much the only confirmed info for Chapter 3, but there's been a lot of fun speculation based on that. Like, the most commonly held belief about these 2 now is that Tenna's gonna be the main boss of Chapter 3 and Mike's the secret boss. Unfortunately, Tenna doesn't follow the common chess theory about main chapter bosses. If you don't know, the idea of chess theory is that each main boss might be a chess piece, and each chapter will descend through each chess piece in point value. So chapter 1 was king, 2 was queen, 3 would be rook, 4 bishop, 5 knight, which would assumedly be the roaring knight, the person opening all the dark fountains, and 6 would be pawn, which people think would be the vessel we made at the start of the game. That means chapter 7 would be, I don't know, Gaster? The theory is mainly based on king and queen being so closely tied to each other, but the problem is king and queen being linked could just as easily be a coincidental connection that other dark worlds won't have. I mean, Queen's basically the only part of the cyber world with any actual ties to the Card Kingdom, and that could easily just be because she's the communal town laptop that was probably used in the abandoned classroom back in the day. That'd mean the chess pattern is more of a chess coincidence, as a knight, king, and queen are all pretty common medieval titles used in fiction. Obviously, if the next main boss is called Rook or Castle, then it pretty much confirmed the chess idea, but you know, there's not really a chess piece called the Tenna. Although, I guess that'd be fine if Tenna's the main boss, that just means the theory's wrong. However, more importantly, I kind of feel like it'd be weird to name drop the secret boss early in these sweepstake pages, or have Spamton reference the next secret boss so directly. They're kinda supposed to be secret. But if Mike isn't the next secret boss, then who might be? Well, one theory that's been getting increasingly popular is that the secret boss might be a cowboy. Remember those 2 minutes of mildly entertaining shootout action? A later Deltarune newsletter mentions that the section may end up cancelled, and even says, well, that's how cowboy shows go, I guess. Which is... yeah, that's an oddly specific way to word that. The common theory is that this is hinting that the secret boss is a cowboy who got their show cancelled, meaning it got abandoned just like the other 2 secret bosses. A more detailed theory that builds off of this one is a theory by Spooky Dude, which suggests that the cowboy might specifically parody Woody from Toy Story, and much like how Spamton being a puppet on a string relates to Chris being controlled by the player, Woody only being able to say a few set phrases when his string is pulled relates to Chris being able to only say what we make them say. It's based on the fact that Toby Fox has been posting tons of edits of the Toy Story theme around that time, but if you want to know the specifics of the theory, go check out that video. There's a few more general theories for what the secret boss might be, mostly based off the idea that both of the secret bosses are objects that have been commonly abandoned from whatever theme their dark world is, like a radio who went obsolete after television, or a TV remote who's always lost in the couch. Although there's also those flowers from Asgore that Toriel always throws away. Those are obviously abandoned, but this time relating to the Dreamer family specifically, rather than just TV in general. People think that could serve as a fun parody of Flowey, although I feel like it's more likely for those Dreamer household objects to show up as just normal characters, so why don't we remind ourselves of some other important things around the house that might come into play. First, there's this bird cage that sometimes contains a weird bird, but usually contains nothing. If there's any object around the house that could be a cool secret boss, it'd probably be this one with some TV coat of paint, but again, I'd imagine it's just a normal NPC. There's also Azriel's computer with the ultimate god of hyperdeath on it, but considering we already had a computer-themed Dark World, and it already had somebody's MS Paint OC drawing as a reference back to Undertale, I feel like this would be unnecessary. There's How to Draw Dragons, a book that shouldn't be as important as it is considering its main distinguishing feature is having an inappropriately dressed reference to one of our main party members. It's a library book that's 2,583 days overdue, which apparently Azriel will never return. And in Chapter 2, we learn that Noelle is so desperate for some inappropriate Susie content that she wants to buy a copy. I don't know why it keeps getting brought up, but if it isn't important somehow, I'll be in shambles. Toriel's room is locked, and while I imagine we'll be allowed in there sometime soon, I don't think the Dark World will reach in there. So the only other important thing around the house is probably Cheriel, the beloved living room chair. But what about Cheriel's non-chair counterpart? It's actually interesting that Toriel says she has to go get sugar from the car at the end of Chapter 2, except that just moments before that, she already had the sugar. Which means she might have suspected that Chris was doing something? This could easily be one of the most important pieces of foreshadowing in literary history, or just as easily be a meaningless oversight. But as for her role in the Dark World itself, most people think that Toriel will just serve the same role Noelle did in Chapter 3, being a confused, innocent temporary party member that we can maybe corrupt for some weird root shenanigans. As for who would fill the role of Birdly, most people think it might be Undyne. The tires being slashed made Toriel call the cops, and Chris left the door open for anyone to enter, so Undyne could easily show up in the Dark World and be a Birdly-styled, recurring soft antagonist and eventual boss fight, who we'd end up killing in the weird route somehow. There's also the possibility of Napstablook showing up, since they're the only other police officer, but no idea what role they'd fill.
You checked the time. It's time for Chapter 4.
In terms of officially revealed information about Chapter 4, there's really only these few screenshots from an old update post. We know these are Chapter 4 because their file names all say CH4, but that also means that speculation is equally sparse. Based on how all these screenshots are from the light world, people think Chapter 4 might serve as a kind of pattern break where there's no dark world for the whole chapter. But if we get a dark world in Chapter 4, people think it'll be the church. It totally makes sense for the church to be a dark world eventually, considering all the religious ties throughout the game so far. I personally see it happening near the end, like Chapter 6 or something, but in Chapter 2, Rudy mentions that church is tomorrow, so it makes sense for it to come much sooner. Alternatively, that could just mean that we're visiting the church tomorrow in the light world, and then it'll become a dark world in a much later chapter. Actually, we're presumably starting Chapter 3 in the dark world, and it's still night, so when we escape the dark world, people think it'll be day and we'll get to explore Hometown during the day for the first time, but that almost makes me think that Chapter 3 will end as soon as the Dark Fountain is sealed, and then the entirety of Chapter 4 is just exploring the light world in the same day. One day, 2 chapters? That's crazy, I know, but it'd explain why we've only seen evidence of a light world in Chapter 4, and we've only seen evidence of a dark world in Chapter 3. It'd also line up with church happening tomorrow, since Chapter 4 would still count as tomorrow. Plus, it makes sense for Susie to say, "Your family is weird, Chris," if this light world segment comes right after Chapter 3's dark world with Toriel. Outside of those ideas, though, we really have no clue what might happen in Chapter 4 specifically. But we do have a lot of details from Chapters 1 and 2 that seem like they'll play out eventually. Do your choices matter if everything ends up the same anyway? That seems to be the underlying theme of Deltarune so far. Right off the bat, the game hits us with the 1-2 punch of your choices don't matter, and your choices do matter. Funnily enough, when Susie tells us that our choices don't matter at the start of the game, it's similar to Flowey saying that this world is kill or be killed in Undertale, even down to it later being directly countered by some weird goat creature. Unlike any of the Asriel adjacent losers though, Susie's got a lot more convincing evidence for her idea. No matter what we do, things seem to ultimately end the same. Whether you beat enemies with good old fisticuffs or with facts and logic, everyone from Chapter 1 still joins your castle town in Chapter 2. And even though Ralsei tries to respect our choices whenever he can, like not explaining the prophecy if we say we don't want to hear it, we'd still hear a summary of the prophecy from Lancer anyway. So even if Ralsei wants to make us feel like our choices matter, he seems to be the only person trying to do so. In fact, the prophecy itself basically suggests that our journey's destined to follow this set path. If the balance of light and dark were to be disrupted, it'd cause the roaring. The dark world would completely overtake the light world, all darkners would turn to stone, and all lightners would be left to fend for themselves against the titans that escape from the dark fountains. You'd think our goal would be to prevent that, but the prophecy specifically says that only after the roaring occurs, then a human monster and Prince of the Dark will appear to seal the fountains and banish the angels' heaven. So, from the start, it's basically telling us that the roaring will occur, and that might just be the only way the game can end. In the Steam page description, Toby Fox has specifically stated that there's only one ending. Question mark. To be honest, I don't think the question mark is there because there isn't just one ending. I think it's just because the major changes in how you get there might feel like different endings. In Chapter 1, Ralsei says that we should use kindness because otherwise we might not like the outcome. That's kind of ominous. And the thing is, he's been right so far. The ending of Chapter 1 isn't nearly as happy if you're violent, but it's still the same ending ultimately, we just went about it a different way. Though there's no greater wrench stuck in the weeds of this discussion than the weird root. It's internally referred to as the weird root in the code, but most of the time people call it the snowgrave root because of the funny snowy spell we force our childhood friend to kill Birdly with. And also because it sounds cooler. Pun retroactively intended, but I'm gonna stick with weird root in this video because it's more vague, so it's more likely that it'll stay applicable in future chapters. Naming shenanigans aside, the weird root is essentially the big counter push to the idea that our choices won't matter. However, interestingly, Noelle's Ice Shock spell is the only reason things can get rolling in the first place, and you just then manipulate Noelle more and more, taking advantage of her natural tendencies to succumb to peer pressure and her trust of Chris, all while she convinces herself that it's okay to do what she's doing because she's finally getting strong enough to fend for herself. And throughout the whole thing, we learn that Noelle seems to black out and completely forget traumatic experiences. But there are specific dialogue choices you have to make to stay on this path, which, well, shucks, I guess that means your choices do matter. Maybe it just means that Chris can't do anything, but we, the player, can. During the final fight against Spamton in the weird root, it seems like he's invincible, and Chris keeps calling for help, but it's only once you call for Noelle that things change. So I guess we got stuck with the lame protagonist that can't do anything, and we just have to try to make do with our cousin's cooler protagonist whenever he brings it over. But that's the thing. Sure, we got to unalive a gamer and traumatize a lesbian, but maybe the whole point of the weird root is to trick out Chris, so we're popping kicks like Noelle? I don't know what I'm saying. Look, what I'm getting at is maybe the goal of the weird root is to make Chris stronger. In Castletown, you're able to fuse items, and one of the currently unobtainable items listed in this menu is the Twisted Sword. You get it by combining the Thorn Ring, which is only obtainable in the weird root, with the currently unobtainable Pure Crystal. The Pure Crystal's description says that it was purified by the cat, which is just vague enough to suggest that it might not be Sham. It's probably Sham though. And that lines up with the fact that Spamton's Shadow Crystal is required in the weird root since he isn't an optional boss anymore. But the resulting Twisted Sword seems to lessen trance, which implies it'd make Chris not under our control anymore? Is that what we want? I mean, Spamton straight up tells us that we will obtain freedom through the weird root, so maybe? But Spamton also says that we've been making hyperlink blocked on the weird root. Now, Spamton says hyperlink blocked a lot, but this is probably the most important use of it because whatever hyperlink blocked is substituting, the weird root apparently has us making it when we otherwise weren't able to. The main theories people have are that it's referring to freedom or power in some way. Spamton actually says both of those words just fine elsewhere, so it's not likely to be those specific words, but the leading theory is that it might be love. In both the traditional definition and also the Undertale specific definition of level of violence. It makes sense that Chris would feel a need for affection considering the monstrous inferiority complex they're rocking, and if the only way to beat the no free will allegations is to become stronger, then level of violence is good as well. Of course, that means Spamton just told us that Noelle and Chris were making love? And unfortunately, there's actually been quite a few uncomfortable romantic undertones throughout the whole weird root. When this guy asks if we're friends or something else, we have to answer something else to get a ring for Noelle, alluding to marriage. On top of that, Noelle even said that she loves scary things, and that might be why she has a crush on Susie, but she constantly describes Chris as scary in the weird root. And when Noelle has the Thorn Ring equipped, her HP automatically drains to a specific amount, 55, which in Roman numerals is LV, the shortened version of level of violence in Undertale. I have no idea what that could all mean, but I have a sneaking suspicion it won't end well. Or well, actually, I guess it'd end the same way the game normally does, but it won't be as fun getting there. There's also the question of if we'll even continue to have more weird route options in future chapters. The only reason to doubt that we will is that the weird route might have only happened because of Noelle specifically. In the Spampton sweepstakes, we learn about Noelle's knack for finding video game glitches and secrets, and in a way, the weird route is similar to a classic creepypasta or glitch. So maybe Noelle's the only person capable of breaking out of the game enough for us to soak in that freedom joyride for a bit. If the weird route turns out to be specific to Noelle, does that mean the goal's to gain control over her? Noelle's compared to an angel at several points in the game. If she's supposed to be or become the angel from the prophecy, it makes sense that we might want to have control over her when she activates Rapture Time and raptures all over the place. On the other hand, the weird route might just be about finding Noelle's sister, December Holiday. Des so far seems to be missing. We don't know if she's dead or simply ran away, but Noelle seems to be the only person trying to find her. Though, that might be a bit difficult. There's one lead we have that may tell us where Des is. Unused text strings that are clearly designed to be found by data miners. In Chapter 1, it's someone unsure of where they are, lost in the dark, pleading for someone to hear them. And in Chapter 2, this progresses with them accepting that no one can hear them. They can't even hear themselves, but sometimes they hear scratching? One of Spampton's shop dialogues about fear seems to make reference to the voice in the code, and Spampton even says that they're talking to us. Most people think this is Des, somehow trapped in the code of the game, so maybe the weird route will take advantage of Noelle's game-breaking habits to reach Des somehow. But no matter what, it seems like the weird route might be the only way for our choices to matter and the outcome to differ. In the hospital, there's one of those sliding bead toys, and both chapters describe the beads grimly marching along a set path. However, in the weird route, one of the blue beads has broken off its path, which might represent Birdley being technically free now. Not the way I'd go about it personally, but you know, to each their own. Now that was a lot about the big things like choices and weird routes, and I don't even know what you're talking about, you should get out of my house. But let's not forget the little guys, like religion, and hugs, and eyes? Religion's obviously all throughout Deltarune. It's clearly important to the Dreamer household specifically. Toriel even has a book of hymns in the living room, but no book of hers to match. But the religion of Deltarune worships the angel, which could be related to the angel's heaven that Ralsei's prophecy said we're supposed to prevent. Which means religion itself is gonna play a pretty big role in Deltarune. I just don't know what that role is. But luckily, since church is tomorrow, we're probably gonna learn a lot more about its significance pretty soon. Similarly, there's a strange pattern of hugs being significant to the Dreamers. Toriel hugs us before school, Asgore hugs us when he first sees us, and hugging Ralsei is like his key character trait. My completely out-of-pocket guess is that hugs are just symbolizing family or something, but there's an equal chance that this doesn't mean anything. Eyes, though, as strange as it sounds, do seem to be meaningful. For one, Spampton's pink and yellow eyes are also shared by this twice mysterious, possible Spampton lookalike. Of course, these literally could be Spampton, as they both appear in very Spampton-y locations. However, some people think it might be a connection to the entity that contacted both the secret bosses, which is probably Gaster. Personally, my first thought was Sans' eye in his fight, but that's yellow and blue, not yellow and pink. Although Jevel's eyes are only yellow, so maybe that means that yellow is the through line? But on the topic of this Jevelish boy, he also matches the other notable eye trait, which is that his eyes are hidden most of the time. Susie reveals her eyes at the end of Chapter 1 when she finally starts to trust us in a touching scene that I can't take seriously anymore because it just reminds me of that one Spider-Man meme.
Hey.
And Ralsei reveals his eyes like 3 times, with this one feeling oddly important. Meanwhile, Chris's eyes remain hidden most of the time, except for the occasional spook. Maybe that's just because they're still under our control? I don't know, I'm just the substitute. Ask your real teacher about it when they're back tomorrow. I mean, while we're throwing out random patterns that may or may not lead to anything, it's pretty odd that seemingly every single sibling in the game is MIA in some capacity. But I don't even have barely a guess as to why that might be. We should also pay attention to Dragon Blazers. It's an in-universe video game series that's been referenced a couple times, but seems to be made to parallel Deltarune. If it does, then there's some important foreshadowing going on. Like this one story Noelle tells us in the Spampton sweepstakes when she was playing Dragon Blazers and got trapped in a glitched maze with no exit because she bypassed the necessary NPC who would normally guide you through it. She randomly came across a door in the maze that nobody's ever seen before, but she could never find the key needed to open it. That feels too specific to not be some kind of hint for a future secret in Deltarune. Also, during Chapter 2, Susie makes an epic gamer reference and mentions that your sister in Dragon Blazers gets her stats dropped down to, well, at least UU, maybe even RU. I'll have to talk to the committee on this one. Lastly, when playing Dragon Blazers with her dad, Noelle mentions that the mage left the party, which could be foreshadowing something about either Ralsei or Noelle herself. Speaking of foreshadowing, the weird intros of each chapter might also be that. Some people think that both of these are flashbacks to something in Chris's past, but I want to know, who was the person who interrupted my husband at the very beginning? We're in the middle of a bonding exercise. Most people think it's Kara because of the Japanese translation, though I feel like that'd be weird considering we're basically playing as Kara. I mean, the name Kara isn't even the official name of this little gremlin, it's only called the true name because it's a meta reference to how all the protagonist characters are referred to as Kara in the code. So for all we know, this child's name could be Chris. Does that mean this voice was Chris? Maybe. I honestly don't expect us to figure anything out about this until much later, but it's good to keep in mind. The last story thing I think we should look out for is the impact of being able to pick up from any chapter. Already, starting from Chapter 2 gives us a couple things of note. Like, the constructed vessel has no name and all default options chosen except for its gift, which is deliberately set to mind. Also, everyone is equipped with the basic Amber Card armor except for Ralsei, who has the white ribbon for some reason. No idea what that means yet, but there's a lot of bigger decisions you can make in Chapter 2, so it'll be interesting to see what the defaults end up being. Oh, and on the topic of save file oddities, for some reason interacting with Azriel's dresser in Chapter 1 says something different depending on which save file slot you're in. This is literally the only thing in the whole game to change between save files like this, and nobody knows what importance this has, so I hope more differences like this pop up, but I also wouldn't be surprised if this was somehow the only one. And that leaves one last major story question we need the answer to. Who is the Roaring Knight? The mysterious entity who, at the very least, created the Card Kingdom and Cyberworld Dark Fountains. I mean, Sham says the knight locked away the 3 kings in Card Kingdom, but also the history of the Dark Worlds are just based on the history of the Light World locations they represent, so the knight could have literally just put 3 king cards away in the Light World, so all we know for sure is that the knight created the Dark Fountains. Unless there's actually multiple knights, but that's a whole other can of worms I don't want to open. At the end of Chapter 2, we see Chris create a dark fountain for themselves, which is pretty in line with basically the only thing we know the knight's done. So when Chapter 2 first came out, the immediate and obvious assumption is that this was a reveal that our beloved androgynous moody teen has secretly been the Roaring Knight all along. However, over the course of 2 years of hyperfixation, people started to assume that it couldn't possibly be Chris. That'd be too soon of a reveal for such a major mystery. But then there was pushback to that pushback, and we don't even really have a solid idea of who is the knight at this point, so let's just start by talking through most of the analysis that's come in over the years. People first started to doubt that Chris was the knight because of one key detail from Chapter 2. When you close the Dark Fountain, Nerdly and Borel are sitting at the desk already. But Chris and Susie, who jumped into the Dark World when it was first opened, are sitting there at the entrance, implying that Birdley and Noelle already sat down at the desk before the Dark Fountain formed. The main fuel for this idea was one bit of narration from inspecting the closet nearby. A large person could easily fit inside. So the knight hid in the closet until Noelle and Birdley showed up, leapt out of the closet, and opened the dark fountain, meaning it couldn't have possibly been Chris, who was distinctly not there yet. To counter this is that 1, Chapter 1 already showed that people can move through the light world, and showed there can be substantial Wile E. Coyote leeway time for people to walk around before falling into said dark world. 2, that line from the closet could just as easily be referencing Queen's giant mech, or it could reference the weird route, implying that Birdley can be deployed in there. But that also doesn't necessarily mean it has to be Chris, just that this isn't a good reason it can't be them. A much more interesting and strong counter-argument to Chris being the knight is that Chris might have only opened a dark fountain specifically to prove the existence of dark worlds to Undyne, so she'll help us. So far in both chapters, Undyne is the only person we're allowed to mention dark worlds to, and she doesn't believe us either time. But Chris just learned how to create a dark fountain since Queen describes it and Birdley almost does it, so by slashing the tires and then opening the front door to perhaps suggest a break-in or some other valid reason for a police officer to enter the house, Chris is nearly guaranteeing that Undyne experiences a dark world for herself. But the TV was plugged in between chapters 1 and 2, so unless Toriel suddenly had a hankering for some telly that morning, it feels like Chris plugged it in last night, meaning they planned this before Queen explained how to make a dark fountain. Chris even has a save file at the start of the game. Save points are only in the dark world, so does that mean Chris has been to the dark world before? In fact, Chris even gets their name back on the save file between chapters 1 and 2, so did they go to the dark world without us? No matter what, Chris is the one you're supposed to assume, which is why people think it'd be a pretty underwhelming answer to who is the knight. For that reason alone, it's at least worth mentioning some other possibilities. Father Alvin is the most commonly believed knight candidate outside of Chris. As a priest, he worships the angel and would have a strong reason to bring about the angel's heaven. Spamton even specifically mentions the knight in relation to communion, which is a religious service that priests provide. And when we overhear Alvin in the cemetery, he says, "Were you proud of me, Father? And is it right for this hammer to..." Hey buddy, I heard ya, please finish your sentence, that sounded a lot like foreshadowing to me. But maybe that's hinting that Alvin's using Gerson's hammer to create the Dark Worlds. Sure, Queen's diagram used a dagger, but Birdley proves that it doesn't have to be a dagger. Although, as dumb as it sounds, Father Alvin doesn't have a dialogue portrait. Obviously, that can simply be added later. It's certainly not an impossible obstacle for the old turtle to overcome, but it does maybe suggest that he isn't as important as we think. Conveniently, pretty much all of that evidence could also work just as well for Gerson. Alvin even mentions that Gerson's a fiction writer, and Dark Worlds conceptually have a lot of connections to the idea of fiction and imagination. Kids imagining these entire worlds just out of random stuff they find around the room. But Gerson's dead. You're gonna have to come up with something wild to justify that one. Well, conveniently, Jar Jar J is well known for his wild theories. In Deltarune, there's a tradition of spreading a monster's dust on whatever their favorite object is when they die, and Jar's theory is that if you bring that object into the Dark World, the resulting Darkener would be imbued with the essence of the monster whose dust was on it. This was actually first a theory that Ralsei is a Darkener formed from Azrael's dust, which means that Azrael's fun time at college is actually a fun time in the afterlife, but later he continued this idea by suggesting that the Knight is actually a Darkener formed from Gerson's hammer. He even came up with the name Oberon Smog off the idea that something that's been revived will have an anagram of its former name, like Azrael and Ralsei. Which could even have a lot of cool implications about the relationship of Deltarune and Undertale themselves. But it's honestly really far out there. Don't get me wrong, those types of theories are my favorite, that's why I brought it up, but I don't really expect it to be real. Though, if the next chapters start giving out clues that support it, it'll feel so crazy that such a wild theory's coming true that I couldn't really pass up mentioning it here. A couple more tame knight options could be Asgore. His motivation for being the knight might connect to whatever got him kicked off the police force. And there's a popular theory that a lot of the main adults in Deltarune, Asgore, Toriel, Rudy, and Mare, had been to the Dark World previously. Obviously, Toriel's reaction to being in the Dark World in Chapter 3 will immediately let us figure out if that's true or not, but also building off that idea, the Mare could be the knight. In City Hall, we learn the mayor likes to keep the AC blasting so that it's really cold in her office, and we also see Noelle in Chapter 1 trapped outside her house where she says her mom doesn't like being interrupted while at work. So people think Noelle's mom might be the mayor. On top of that, in Asgore's flower shop, there's a rent due notice on the ground from C, and people think that may also be the mayor, and that C may stand for Carol, since every one of the holidays has a very holiday-themed name.
Just a week away. Oh, wow.
Chris already has Christmas covered, so I guess the C has to be Carol. But anyway, under the assumption that the mayor is Noelle's mother, she may be opening Dark Worlds in search of Des. Could also be Papyrus, who is being mysteriously hidden from us, and according to the Steam description of Deltarune, is busy. With what? Making dark fountains, clearly. Though I personally doubt that Toby Fox would make an Undertale character such a key player in Deltarune, especially someone as popular already as Papyrus. There's also, Gaster. He's an option. Can you tell I'm not personally that invested in any of these knight options? The way I see it right now, the only way I'd care about the knight is if it's Chris, because all other candidates aren't really fleshed out as characters yet. The main issue people have with it being Chris is that it'd be lame to answer the big question of who is the knight so early into the game, but like, is that a big question? I never even thought about it that hard until the end of Chapter 2, when I was basically given the answer. To me, this just means that the question we should care about isn't who's the knight, it's why is Chris doing this? There'd be a conflict where we as the player aim to seal dark fountains and prevent the roaring, while the knight, the one who's been opening all these fountains, is the character we control. That's not saying I'd be disappointed if Chris isn't the knight, or that I even consider it particularly likely that it's them, all things considered. I mean, we still have no idea who closed the closet on Chris and Susie in Chapter 1. You'd assume the knight did it, but that doesn't work if the knight's right here. But since we know practically nothing about the knight as a character yet, I don't really care who they are. I care about Chris. What's up with Chris? First of all, it's clear that Chris and the player are separate entities. Chris acts without our control while we're stuck twiddling our thumbs in the baby cage. And between Chapter 1 and 2, inspecting the mirror goes from saying, "It's only you," to now saying, "It's what they call you." Chris was also seemingly good at piano in the past, but when we control them, we suck. I'm really curious to learn more about Chris's past in future chapters. We know that Chris was a pretty quiet, weird kid, but would also play pranks on Noelle, although when we try to play a prank, they seem upset about it, so there seems to be something more to their pranktrocities than meets the eye. There's actually a really good theory about this by Half-Bred Chaos, saying that there may be something dangerous lurking in the light world waiting to attack the people of Hometown. Perhaps the time that Chris, Noelle, Azriel, and Des all explored behind the cemetery, they found this creature. Noelle says they didn't find anything, but she also says she was crying of fear for some reason, and she's not exactly the most trustworthy narrator for potentially traumatic events. And perhaps Chris didn't slash the tires of Toriel's car. Maybe this creature did, and Chris was just fending it off. This would also mean that many of the quote-unquote pranks that Chris pulls was actually them trying to protect Noelle. Like when Chris shook the Ferris wheel cart they were riding with Noelle, it might have been because the dangerous creature was latched on. Or when Chris hid under Noelle's bed, they might have been there ready to fend off the creature if it attacked. Or Chris telling Noelle that Icy is real and he eats kids. Yeah, the theory is that Icy is real, and multiple times Icy is compared to a cryptid, so Icy might be that dangerous creature lurking in Hometown, and Chris is trying to protect everyone from it. That might even be why Chris was getting into magic. There's obviously gotta be some reason they have a history of trying magic. After all, it's heavily implied that monsters in Deltarune can't do magic naturally, so Chris isn't simply trying to learn magic to fit in with their monster peers. Although monsters are the only ones who can do magic in the dark world, so maybe there's still a bit of that. Alternatively, the demon summoning classes for teens implies that Chris just summoned whatever dangerous creature is roaming around hometown. Or actually, most people think that Chris summoned us, the player. But on the topic of the player and Chris, is the player literally in Deltarune? Or is there some in-game entity controlling Chris that simply represents our dynamic of a player controlling a game character? I mean, the cage that Chris throws our soul into in Chapter 1 is already there before we, the player, have shown up, and it's seemingly been used, implying that Chris has been dealing with the situation before we arrived. And did Chris opt into being controlled? They don't always seem thrilled with the options we choose, and we literally save over their save file at the start of both chapters, but they always put their soul back in after taking it out, despite seeming pretty capable on their own. And weirdly, I feel like Chris has more control over the situation than it seems, considering they force us into using the bathroom sink in Chapter 1, and at seemingly any moment have the ability to rip their soul out and go do mysterious teen stuff. Or is Chris not the one acting without our control? Is there a spooky doopy third entity in control of Chris, making them eat pie, break gas pipes, and worst of all, do slightly dangerous but admittedly very cool ninja jumps out of windows? Well, I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of there being a third entity because that means that Chris themselves has done nothing all game, but there's a lot of people who think there is a third entity, and there's decent reason to think so. Especially since Chris makes a dark fountain right next to their mom even in the weird route, when we clearly showed that we can and will turn people into frosty treats if given the chance. Now, personally, I prefer chicken over lamb, but Chris doesn't know that. For all they know, this is putting Toriel in mortal danger, which would be weird to do willingly, but that's also what makes me so invested in Chris as a character. Whatever. That's enough about Chris. What's up with Ralsei? For one, he's Asriel. I mean, he isn't actually Asriel as far as we know, but he's obviously supposed to look like Asriel, and I feel like unless Toriel conveniently avoids meeting him for all of Chapter 3, we're probably gonna learn at least something more about that. Though to be fair, Noelle also knew Asriel and all we got was, "It looks like ... So maybe Toriel will just be like, "That's weird, kinda looks like my son." Oh well. But there's a lot more strange things about Ralsei outside of his dashing good looks. Like, he doesn't turn to stone outside of his home fountain like other Darkners. And at the start of Chapter 2, he just shows up somehow. He says that he sensed this dark world and so he, walked here? These both almost suggest that he's actually a Lightner in some way, but I feel like the massive traffic jam outside of the library might have noticed some weird Asriel waltzing on in when he's supposed to be at college. Third thing is that he weirdly seems aware of our presence as the player and takes advantage of each chance to pull our perspective away to talk to Chris in private, saying, "So that's why." Which could really be about pretty much anything. He also seems to value our dialogue choices, even when it doesn't make any difference and it contradicts what Chris clearly wants, almost like he's trying to be more friendly to us than to Chris. Although, the weird route is when we force Ralsei to not have some alone time to talk to Chris. So, my game theory, wait, I can't make that reference anymore, can I? Game theory is that Ralsei might actually be the one telling Chris to make dark fountains at the end of each chapter. Maybe because it'd allow for us, the player, to continue our fun adventures, or maybe just so Chris can gather more friends to stop the roaring. I'll be the first to admit that on the scale of out-of-pocket theories, this one's up there, but I like throwing in a little baseless theory crafting to spice up the otherwise mostly objective observations. Sue me. Don't actually sue me, I don't have money. But I gotta say, the weirdest thing about Ralsei is how much he seems to perfectly fit the patterns of the secret bosses. I already mentioned how both bosses are objects that are often abandoned, but also both of their personalities seem to reflect different responses to the idea that your choices don't matter. Jevil sees the whole world as a game with no feeling of responsibility or consequence. Meanwhile, Spamton obsesses over the idea of breaking out of his lack of choice and obtaining true freedom. Now, what exact reason our choices won't matter isn't clear yet at all. At first, people thought maybe Jevil and Spamton just learned that they're in a video game, which would make sense. Though another idea, from Jaru again, is that there's a time loop. You know, at the end of the game, the roaring will occur and the timeline will be reset. That would be a pretty good reason to feel like your choices don't matter. And obviously the assumption is that the two little guys were told their choices don't matter by the mysterious entity who originally contacted them, which is, again, probably Gaster. We can already assume that it was Gaster for numerous reasons.
Hey Gaster, you still there, dog? Yeah? Uh-huh. A goose? That's crazy. Alright, thanks.
But outside of the obvious textual references to good old Wingle Dingus, there's also what fans call the freedom leitmotif. People think it's going to be an ongoing motif that'll carry throughout all secret bosses. And something super interesting that I saw pointed out by someone far smarter than me, Andrew Cunningham, is that it's Gaster's theme.
The notation isn't lying here. Every single note on the right matches one from Gaster's theme, just a semitone higher. Or alternatively, if we just fill in the suspicious pause created by this one elongated note... Huh, would you look at that?
But how do all these patterns apply to Ralsei? Well, Ralsei is a prince without any subjects, completely abandoned and alone. We could also guess that Ralsei heard the prophecy from Gaster, considering he describes it as being foretold by space and time. A very specific choice of words with some very specific ties to Gaster. And Ralsei clearly has a lot to say about the idea that our choices don't matter. His response just happens to be that he thinks they matter anyway. If you assume the thing that made Jevil and Spamton go crazy is that they realize they're in a video game, then that would explain why Ralsei seems to pander so much to us, the player, more than Chris. But if you assume that the idea of a time loop is correct, then it also makes sense why Ralsei would know things he shouldn't, like our names. Music-wise, Ralsei doesn't really have any secret ties to Gaster's theme or anything, but 3 out of 4 is pretty good. Now with Ralsei out of the way, what's up with Noelle? She seems to be the only person who notices that Chris is acting differently now that we control them. Something she probably notices a whole lot more on the weird route. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, Noelle being referred to as Angel multiple times and even making this angel doll with Des implies that Noelle is the angel, or at least has significant ties to the angel. Though, it could also mean that Des is the angel in some regard. Obviously, we don't know enough about her to be confident in that conclusion, but there's a ton of mystery surrounding her. The Spamton sweepstakes page named Des shows this orange guitar that's for some reason called a red guitar, probably as a subtle hint to the plot-crucial Chris colorblindness lore that'll become way more relevant in the secret Simon Says boss fight in Chapter 5. This page also plays the song Find Her, so finding Des does seem to be the main goal here, but Noelle and Rudy are the only people who mention Des in the whole town, and Noelle seems to be the only person interested in finding her. Maybe in her classic quirky way, she blocked out the traumatic event that caused Des's disappearance, but everybody else already knows that it's futile to look for her. Most people theorize that whatever Asgore did indirectly led to Des's disappearance, and that everyone in town just assumes she's dead now. Or maybe Des went down to the Gaster bunker, got shattered across space and time, and now just vibes with her weird roommate in outer existence. And for the last of our main party, what's up with Susie? Actually, no, my main question with her is, why does it feel like Susie is simultaneously both the least and most important character? On one hand, she's the center of everyone's affection. See, you can buy some tea here that'll be the flavor of one of your party members, and that's a little weird, but the important thing is that how people react to the tea flavor reflects how they feel about the person. Like, we learned that Chris and Noelle both heal a lukewarm 70 HP from each other, so maybe they aren't close friends after all. Or that Chris doesn't seem to care for Ralsei that much. Don't know why that would be, But in stark contrast, Chris heals 120 HP from Susie T. Actually, Susie T is the only T that heals everyone for the max amount, or more. In fact, this flavor text implies Chris might also have a crush on Susie, plus the How to Draw Dragons book kind of implies that Asriel would probably be into Susie too. It's ridiculous. Even Birdly has a crush on her. But on the other hand, her role in the prophecy is literally just a monster. Chris is the only human and Rouse is the only Dark Prince, but Susie's role could easily be filled by any monster. And Susie doesn't have any direct ties to any big existential mysteries, and seems fairly open overall, but she does seem to be getting set up for a rude awakening, as she still doesn't seem to fully realize that Darkners like Lancer can't exist in the light world, and I guess she does have all these implications of having a not-so-great home life, so at least she has that going for her. Who's Everyman? You know, Everyman. I mean, he was one whole attack back in Undertale, and now he's shown up as graffiti and rarely as a few other attacks. Yeah, okay, he doesn't have a whole lot going on, but he's weird at least. Maybe he's the knight, maybe he's the man giving out eggs, maybe he's just the monster equivalent of a stick figure. I don't know, but lots of people think that he might have some greater importance going forward. And now, for your consideration, Gaster? I'll be honest, I don't have much to say about him. His possibly goopy, possibly skeletal, possibly hands are all over this game. It all started when he was on Twitter, where he gave us the first demo of Deltarune under the mysterious title of Survey Program, and even had us accept everything that will happen. Though it's a little hard to say how crucial this vague threat is to Deltarune as a whole, because future releases on Steam aren't titled Survey Program and don't have that disclaimer. Gaster also lets us do a bit of Build-A-Bearing, with his most obvious appearance in anything. I mean, the sequence is referred to in the code as Goner Maker, he speaks to us in all caps, like entry 17, the background music is Gaster's theme. And he even says very, very wonderful. I'm sure he would have loved to say very, very interesting, but unfortunately, I'm quite boring. There's also a Gaster shelter, which we admittedly only suspect has Gaster in it because this mechanical sound you're hearing is the Gaster sound from entry 17, played 666% slower. Very Gaster. And in Chapter 2, your dialogue portraitless classmates are all like, "This place is scary, Chris told us about it," implying that Chris may know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two. And I don't know how to say this, but you have some Gasters stuck in your save select screen. Outside of the fact that Gaster is apparently in control of our save files, at least until we beat Chapter 1, there's nothing else to point out here. So yeah, I know Gaster's gonna keep cropping up somehow, but we really have no clue how exactly he's gonna play into all of this. Another character who's proving to be quite important is Sean. It made sense for them to know about Jevel since they used to work together, but why do they know that the next secret boss will be impossible to beat without the Shadow Mantle? And why did they conveniently lose said mantle? It's implied that Jevel shared a lot of knowledge he gained from probably Gaster with Sham, and that Sham didn't completely disregard it as the insane ramblings of a madman. It's also concerning that this cat with connections to the secret bosses, knowledge they shouldn't have, and a Gaster face is collecting all of the shadow crystals from us. Some people think Sham might be a secret boss in the future. Their nihilistic outlook on the world would certainly line up with the pattern of secret bosses representing responses to your choices not mattering, although we don't really know enough about the shadow crystals to know if Sham taking them is a good thing or not. Like, we still aren't quite sure what looking through a shadow crystal even shows us, and that's their only function. When used in the dark world, we just see the light world version of that place, so pretty cut and dry, but in the light world it's a lot less clear as there's no real pattern being formed out of our very small sample size. The current biggest theories I've seen around are that they might show the past, or if we're going with time loop theory, the future. Or maybe they show how people perceive whatever you're looking at. Like, most people see Susie as just a bully still, most people ignore Chris entirely, and most people would assume the computer lab still looks like the computer lab. But the most straightforward theory is that they just show you what this world would look like without Chris. Chris is invisible, Susie didn't get her epic Chapter 1 character development, and well, that would kind of have to rely on Chris being the knight, because then if Chris didn't exist, the Dark Worlds wouldn't exist either, except for Castletown that we already kind of assume wasn't created by the knight and has just always been there, I guess. That's kind of weird in its own right, but either way, we can assume shadow crystals are probably connected to Gaster in some way. Or can we? When you bring Sham the second shadow crystal, they mention that Spamton may have found it in the old machine, and that it might have been there because the machine was important to a certain Lightner. And that's it? Wait, does that mean that all of Spamton's similarities to Jevil, being abandoned, meeting Gaster, having knowledge he shouldn't have, that has nothing to do with the shadow crystals? He just found it in the machine by pure happenstance? I might be misinterpreting that, to be honest, but either way, I eagerly await more info from our lovely Sham. The Eggman is also quite the important fellow. We don't know who he is, but the most common theory is that the Eggman is Gaster. He's found in rare secret rooms that appear in between normal rooms, just like the Mystery Man in Undertale, who we're decently sure is Gaster. Plus, he's referred to as just a man, and he is a mystery, which would certainly qualify him to be a mystery man. However, there's a semi-recent development that shakes things up. For Valentine's Day, there were a lot of cards given out from various Undertale and Deltarune characters, one of which was Gaster. At least that's what people thought. However, this video from Spooky Dude basically pointed out that from the tone of the letter and the pattern of saying one thing and then immediately saying the opposite, this letter is probably from the Eggman, but not from Gaster. In fact, it feels like such a clear divide between the Eggman and Gaster that it almost makes me think that Undertale's Mystery Man is the Egg guy, but isn't Gaster, which would be... well, honestly, they'd have to have a real good reason to make this not Gaster, because otherwise people would have spent a decade getting attached to the wrong guy. So just to be safe about all these Valentine shenanigans, you can probably ignore the card completely. I doubt Toby Fox would pull a FNAF on us where some random thing from outside the game is necessary to understand Deltarune. I mean, even Noelle's connection to video game glitches was hinted at in-game, so for now we can continue to treat Gaster and the Eggman as equally mysterious, potentially connected entities until some wacky new info comes up in-game. A much more straightforward theory is that the Eggman's Papyrus. It could always be Papyrus. We know nothing about what the old Paps is up to, plus he has this random egg in the dating scene in Undertale, he hides behind this suspiciously familiar tree in some Undertale merch, and he has just about an equal amount of loose ties to Gaster as the Eggman does. So that's basically as good as a confirmation. As for the eggs themselves, there's a theory that they represent the literal idea of Easter eggs in video games. This is mostly based on the fact that the egg multiplies when put into Asgore's fridge, since putting the egg in the fridge is itself another Easter egg. This doesn't really hold up as strongly when thinking about reverse stealing the egg, resulting in losing the Easter egg, but that kind of joke also doesn't feel entirely out of the realm of possibility for Deltarune. Alternatively, the eggs could simply represent glitches, referencing the bad egg glitch from the 3rd generation of Pokemon. If you had a bad egg in your Pokemon box, it'd spread and multiply, much like how the egg multiplies in Asgore's fridge. But again, it doesn't really explain the whole reverse stolen egg thing that well. But Noelle, our glorious savior, or eventual destroyer, also gives us some more insight on the mysterious eggs in the sweepstakes. The egg never hatched and she could never get rid of it, but when she took care of it, the egg left on its own due to happiness. Similarly, you can't get rid of the eggs in Deltarune. If you drop one, it'll reappear once you re-enter the Dark World. But putting the egg in Asgore's fridge or reverse stealing it seems to actually get rid of them, which maybe means those make the eggs happy enough to leave? That was probably the most... no, I've definitely said more insane things before, but it's actually possible that there's a good reason to keep these eggs unhappy and firmly planted in our inventory. Lancer makes a joke about you needing at least one egg to get through your teens. And yeah, this is just a reference to Earthbound, but guess what? So was this, and that didn't stop that line from being important. A reference can be just as important as any other line, Mom. Also, the Chapter 2 egg becomes unavailable in the weird route. Is that important? Does that even matter, since we could already get one from Chapter 1 and Lancer only says we need one? I don't know, but I feel like it's time to rapid fire through the less important characters. Starting with Sans. Well, okay, he's still decently important. For one, he befriended our mom last night, but more importantly, he continues to have some of the most meta dialogue in the game, even though he already had all of Undertale to do that. In Chapter 1, you can greet him by saying, "OMG, Sans Undertale," even though we've never met. And in Chapter 2, you can bring up his brother even when he didn't tell you about his brother in Chapter 1. Sans points out that we're weird both times, which is fair, but there's no other character where you get dialogue options like this. Sure, in Chapter 2, Susie and Ralsei both say something like "waiting for today felt like years," which is a funny reference to the fact that waiting for today took years. But Sans literally says the amount of time it took. His is so much more direct. There's also the question of why does Sans have so many ties back to Undertale? His house is the same, though to be fair, so is Snapstub looks. But his store is just Rilby's, and his theme is ported straight over from Undertale. At the same time, Undertale Sans has a lot of retroactive references to Deltarune. The door to his room resembles the transportation doors from the Dark World, and Papyrus even describes Sans' room as feeling like another world. Sans' crossword is also the only instance of IC in Undertale, while IC is a major brand here in Deltarune. Then of course there's Sans' workshop, with a picture of Sans with "people you don't recognize" and a note labeled "don't forget," the name of Deltarune's main theme. This note only appears after talking to this clam girl about Susie, which, despite being misspelled, is definitely in reference to Deltarune's most famous How to Draw Dragons lookalike. The most common theory about all of this is that Sans is originally from Deltarune and got transported to Undertale somehow, but then why would his shop clearly have said Grilby's first and was then modified to say Sans if it hasn't been Grilby's yet? Did he arrive in Deltarune from Undertale? That would mean that he was originally from somewhere else before both of those, which I don't think is likely. Although personally, what I'm actually most curious about is Sans' brother still Papyrus? Every time we mention Sans' brother, it's never by name. And why isn't Papyrus in the picture with Sans that we think might be Sans Deltarune? We'd recognize Papyrus if it was in the picture. To be fair, interacting with Sans' door makes direct reference to Bone Trousel, and naming yourself Papyrus gets the same reaction as all other major hometown names. So it's probably him. But why are they being so coy about it? Is Papyrus even important? Rules card. I honestly didn't expect him to play a role in Chapter 2, and that alone makes him noteworthy. There's some ideas floating around that he might continue to show up in each chapter until finally serving as a big boss fight at some point, maybe even a secret boss. And if that's the case, maybe he's the one who took the Shadow Mantle from Sham? Lots of people also point out how Rules card looks like Gaster to some degree, just like the two secret bosses, so trying to prevent us from fighting future secret bosses could make sense if he's tied into all that. There's also the two continuing storylines of Onion and Metaton. Onion's set to investigate the mysterious song they hear below the water at night. It's only a part of a song, but Onion's heard the whole thing from the ocean before, and considering the track record of Undertale's River Person referencing some pretty important Deltarune ideas, this song from the sea seems like it could be pretty important. Meanwhile, Metaton... well, right now Metaton's story doesn't seem nearly as crucial, but he does have a direct connection to Spampton with, you know... Though what's most interesting about both of these is that starting the stories requires a bit of extra effort, and so does continuing them in Chapter 2, which means it'd be pretty easy to lose out on these stories entirely. So I'll be curious to see what secret elusive payoff there might be. Or just see Onion tell us that the song Under the Water was just the first working jukebox in the series and there was nothing more to it. At the moment, we don't know much about our final two classmates, Caddy and Joggington, but they have dialogue portraits, so they're probably important. Caddy's probably a bit more important than Joggington though, since she has specific ties to Chris with the magic studying and whatnot, while Joggington, sports? But the hometown mayor is definitely going to be important, especially if she actually is Noelle's mom, but no matter who the mayor is, we know she's currently preparing for the upcoming festival, which means we'll definitely learn more about her then. Unfortunately, I don't think Rudolph Rudy Holiday, yeah, I'm using his full legal name, will be quite as important. Don't get me wrong, his mysterious illness is definitely going to be important for Asgore and Noelle and probably the mayor, but I don't think Rudy himself will do much except make me sad. There's also Burger Pants, now called Pizza Pants to reflect his new pizza-based occupation. I'm only bringing him up just to say that he talks about Azrael quite a bit, was apparently Azrael's friend, and has a dialogue portrait, so he'll probably be important at some point. However, that importance is worrying. In Undertale, Burger Pants has the iconic line, "I can't go to hell, I'm all out of vacation days," which was directly referenced by Spampton right after trying to talk about the night. And in Chapter 1, Jevil compares the roaring to hell, which creates a concerning link between Pizza Burger with both the secret bosses and the night. But you didn't hear that from me. Last thing to touch on is Dark Worlds. We should immediately acknowledge the fact that Dark Worlds are pretty likely to be the exact thing Grandpa Blaster was talking about in Entry 17. And I'll do the same thing every Deltarune content creator has done for the past 2 years, and defer to Misty Sparkles, someone who can present the information with more joy in her voice than I could ever muster.
Come Chapter 2, there appear to be multiple Dark Worlds, with new ones being created. What might this remind us of? The darkness keeps growing, the shadows cutting deeper, photon readings negative. This closet is emitting darkness, as if it had the same properties as light. I think photon readings would have to be negative in order to do that.
But yeah, it shouldn't really be a surprise that Gaster has some connections to the Dark Worlds. What's more surprising are the 3 other ideas that seem to be connected to Dark Worlds just as strongly. The connections to oceans are currently the least numerous, but what is there is still interesting. Very, very interesting. When we first wake up in the Dark World of Chapter 1, we hear the sound of the ocean. The Dark Fountains also have the same texture as the background of Gaster's Build-A-Bear segment, which notably is a cropped picture of the ocean. Due to the connections between Dark Worlds and the ocean, people think the Song from the Sea that Onion tells us about might even be connected to the Dark Worlds. I, for one, knew that Onion was evil all along. I could see it in their eyes. The connections to dreams are constant and continuous, and I have no idea what it could all mean. Please make us stop. Besides characters just talking about it, going to sleep at the start of each chapter also skips straight to the Dark World. You know, Chapter 3 will be the first time people who are currently sleeping will enter the Dark World. If the connections to dreams really are significant, I imagine that'll have some interesting ramifications. Or it'll just make it way easier to convince Toriel that this is all a dream, since she's already dreaming. Then lastly, there's the connection to fiction. The main idea being that creating Dark Worlds simply represents the idea of creating fiction, and that the roaring reflects how fiction can completely take over someone's life. That such a story, created for such a simple purpose, could blossom into such a large, wonderful, world-changing thing. That is the majesty of words, Chris. I'm a big fan of this connection, even if it doesn't have nearly as many strong in-game references yet, and might just end up being a meta-textual thing, but I'm curious where it'll go. While we're revisiting some earlier topics, I wanted to touch on secret bosses again briefly. We already talked about all the patterns that most people think will continue with the future secret bosses, but there's also this idea being thrown around that each boss might cycle through all the major colors of hearts from Undertale. This idea is almost entirely based on the patented "it'd be cool" principle, because our current pattern of one example doesn't exactly convince me that this would continue, but it'd be cool to see all the other heart forms come back. It's also worth pointing out that when you beat a secret boss, they become your strength by turning into an equipable item, so technically the secret bosses we beat are still with us. But strangely, it's only if you beat Jevil violently that he says "take me" when giving you his item. If you beat him peacefully, he says "take this." But Spamton says the same thing either way, so it's hard to tell if that's actually significant. What's weirder though, and definitely significant, is that despite being forced to fight Spamton in the weird route, he scams us out of our goodies. Probably because he's dead, but that's still no excuse for poor service. The weird route also loses out on getting the egg, as I mentioned earlier, so I'm really curious to figure out more about these random items we keep accruing, so that we can finally feel the true fear of realizing the consequences we'll face for missing out on them in the weird route. As for the Dark Worlds themselves, similar to the pattern with secret bosses, there's a pattern that each Dark World is a place that's been abandoned. The classroom is literally an abandoned classroom, the computer lab was abandoned because the internet's out in town, and the TV hasn't been used presumably since Azrael went to Study Town. It also seems like each Dark World might need to be connected to entertainment in some way. Board games, computers, and now TV. I don't really know what other options that'd leave other than books, or maybe playing make-believe in the woods and getting lost. Yeah, not leaving a whole lot of options, so maybe just an odd coincidence. Besides, neither of those patterns line up with the idea of the church being a future Dark World. Actually, on that note, some other possible Dark World locations could be like the Gaster Bunker, or maybe Sans' house. I mean, he's already got the fast travel ready for us. There's also Asgore's flower shop, that's obviously going to be important in some way with all these flowers, plus it already has the double-door Dark World entrance set up in the back. Or, operating off the double assumption that Chris is the knight and the Dark Worlds are purposely all connected to entertainment, Mettaton's request to bring him entertainment tomorrow might, well, you know. Good Lord! For a couple other small random options, there's QC's Diner, the hottest place to get some cold drinks, Icy's Pizza, the coldest place to get some hot food, and maybe even Noelle's house, which I don't think is a restaurant, but we haven't seen it yet, so who knows. And most people think we'll get more quirky pairs in those Dark Worlds like Noelle and Birdley. I already mentioned how people think Toriel and Undyne will be that for Chapter 3, but another common option is Caddy and Jockington. In fact, they're kinda the only other pair people could think of. But can I be honest? I personally feel like that's limiting ourselves too much. I don't think anyone will serve such direct copies of Noelle and Birdley's roles from Chapter 2, especially when it comes to the weird route. I don't even think they'll be similar. My honest prediction is probably the most boring possible outcome, which is that Noelle is just a special case in all regards. There won't be any more weird route shenanigans without her, and nobody else will be playable in future chapters. Toriel won't join our party in Chapter 2, we won't manipulate her, and we won't kill Undyne. Obviously, that's not necessarily the outcome I'm hoping for. My hope is that most characters get in on the playability party. Maybe even a wacky endgame thing where you can add the previous secret bosses to your team somehow. Of course, that probably won't happen, but the best part of hope is being unrealistic and enjoying the fun of those unrealistic ideas, while the best part of expectations is keeping them grounded enough to be pleasantly surprised when something wacky happens. Oh my god, I almost forgot to mention the single black pixel running gag. There was a single black pixel accidentally left in King's boss fight arena in Chapter 1, and everyone complained about it, so Toby Fox removed it by just moving it somewhere else, and then in Chapter 2 it was there again in Queen's arena, and that probably means that it's gonna be a running joke for every main boss arena from now on. Hey, so I don't normally mention this, but this was a really long video that took even longer to make, so, you know, consider throwing me a couple bucks each month on Patreon. Help me justify the amount of time I'm spending on this kind of stuff. Or go check out what was originally the first half of this video before I realized that it was far too long and unnecessary, so I'd split it off into a wacky spin-off on my side channel. I swear the spin-off will be just as good as the original. Alright, bye.